In our day-to-day culture, we are all of us looking for a transcendent experience, an experience from love, an experience from our culture, our institutions, our religion, and in ourselves. If our culture is largely consumerist, and if we're struggling to find love, we need to go into ourselves. We find that spring again. We come home to ourselves.
When we talk about the complex patient, what do we mean?
The complex patient is defined by the NHS as the top 1 or 2% in terms of resource consumption. But when you look at that more systematically, you see it in different settings in different ways. In mental health care settings, they accumulate all sorts of different labels. Sometimes autism, high and fluctuating risk, eating disorders, medically unexplained symptoms, addictions, personality disorders, that sort of thing. So it's a sort of mosaic of things. Glenn Gabbard in the United States talks about it as being a sort of intersubjective issue. That there's something about it, a situation that makes deciphering what's going on quite difficult. I think what's really important to understand is that we all go into different states of meaning. So there's a primary one when we're born into. This is a sort of omnipotent state where I'm the world and the world is me. And that's how we regulate our emotions through magical thinking, that sort of thing. And you can see that with some patients who enter a psychosis or a mania or severe eating disorders. The next stage is the secondary intersubjectivity, whereby it's a two-person psychology. You can build a relationship with another person. So a patient can develop a relationship with their doctor, with their care coordinator, with the world around them. Baby can make a relationship with mother and vice versa. The key aspects of regulate emotion around then is projection. So projecting emotions that are don't like into other people and other things, or splitting, as in separating between good and bad. Folks can struggle with triangulation. They can't imagine the other person having a life and mind outside of themselves. And some people really struggle with that. They can build a relationship with their care coordinator, with the service, but if the care coordinator is away or leaves the service, suddenly can't cope because they're plunged back into a sense of despair. And then finally, after that, healthy development is territory. So you can triangulate. You can think that the other person has a life and mind outside of you. Mother has life beyond the baby. And with that comes symbolic thinking, abstract thinking. Now, this is enormously helpful and important in psychotherapy, because if your psychotherapy is based on triangulation, on abstract thinking, on symbolic thinking, and if the patient can't do those things, then it's not going to work. And quite a lot of psychotherapy works on that. So CAT, some forms of MBT, some forms of CBT, they use all sorts of abstract thing, and the patient just can't use them. And it's not because they're ignorant or anything like that. It's because they're just in a very different meaning-making state. That's not to say that they could never do it, but at that moment.
So what is it that makes psychoanalysis well-suited to that kind of patient as opposed to other types of therapy?
Discovered by Freud and comes out of an engagement with the complex patient at the time, the hysterical woman. A woman who doesn't obey her father, doesn't obey the priest, doesn't obey the doctor, doesn't obey her husband, and has a whole host of different issues. One of the great discoveries from psychoanalysis is that it's one of the first times in psychiatry whereby people start actually listening to the patient in a meaningful way, and helps to deconstruct what's going on for them and to co-produce meaning so that they can be reintegrated with parts of themselves or back into dialogue. Because oftentimes patients are trapped in a sort of symbolic punishment of their own upbringing that's now become concrete. So over and over again, get trapped in something. I think at the heart of it is that psychoanalysis focuses, or largely psychodynamic work focuses on a few main therapeutic aspects. One is the therapeutic relationship, who you are with the patient. Linked to that is what's called the transference. That is to say, the person brings in their unconscious parts of themselves that they're not aware, and the relationships that are from the past. And that can be very useful because it gives you a sense of what's going on for them. I think there's quite a lot of what's called unconscious communication in therapy. That is to say, people are projecting images and feelings into the therapist for the therapist to process and feedback. No, they're doing this unconsciously, not doing it. Where psychoanalysis enables people to tune into that by what's called the countertransference. That is to say, their own experience of the patient in the room. And that's incredibly important because it gives you a sense of what's going on between you and what's going on with the other person.
And why is psychoanalysis typically so intensive in terms of doing 4 or 5 sessions a week?
I think the idea there is about holding and containment, so that when things do crop up, a person is held by the frame of the therapy. So when it's 50 minutes is up, it's up. And then if there's anything residual, it comes back the following day. So it can help that way, move things along. I think you can do analytical work at less frequent. It's quite difficult. You can do it between 1 session all the way up to 5 sessions, depending on your availability and the patient's availability. Theorists over the years have changed some of the technique, so not everyone has to use the couch. Oftentimes, I think it was with Jung that began seeing the patient face to face, and that still works. So different people use different techniques to help them to get in touch with the parts of themselves that are unconscious, and through that then reintegrates with themselves.
What did Jung think was the utility of working face to face as opposed to the patient being on the couch?
I think it is more collaborative, less persecutory. So the purpose of the couch is, well, it historically comes from hypnosis. So it helps with regression and relaxation. They can go back to these earlier states. They can go into, even though in their day-to-day life they can be fully functioning, adult with a job and so on. Then at the couch you can bring up all this other stuff. I think face-to-face they can still do it as well, but in a very different way. I think people feel more secure seeing the therapist face-to-face. Some folks can lie on the couch and feel it is very persecutory because of all this anxiety. Symptoms are coming out. They can feel very vulnerable.
Which way do you work and why?
I work both ways. In my room with patients, there is a couch. People are free to use it or not use it. I think oftentimes my experience has been that people are slightly afraid of the couch because of the vulnerability. I think a lot of the patients that I do see have very severe trauma and deprivation. So, vulnerability is a big part of it. So they find the couch could put them into states that would really harm them. So I leave it up to them. And if it feels right for them, then we can think about it. Because the purpose of our work is to provide a space that we can think and reflect about what's going on for the person, and they can use that experience in their lives.
What would the lived experience be of someone who is in that place?
Symptoms that oftentimes don't yield to treatment. And I think that those symptoms are, like, for instance, cyclical vomiting, complex pain, that sort of thing, are communications. There's something going on there. And you see it again and again in different clinical settings. These are people who frequently attend the emergency department, 5, 6, 7, 800 times, or they go into other clinics. The vast majority of these people don't come anywhere near psychiatrist. And so the problem with that is it can envision iatrogenic harm. So people can have lots of investigations that are unnecessary. They can be products of lots of polypharmacy, lots of medications. And one of the reasons why I like psychoanalysis is because it gives a thinking space to that, to what's going on. Because I think at all times in the clinical setting, there is an attack on people's thinking, whether it's service pressures, whether it's a pressure from patients or family that you have to have a quick fix, or pressures from the wider society of trying to be all-powerful and all-knowing. FitzGerald talks about patients are looking for an enactment. They're looking for an engagement with what's going on inside them, i.e. get their care needs met. But if you've had a very difficult upbringing and if you've had a rather sadomasochistic engagement with life, then you'll bring that into the work. And patients, doctors, family members will act in ways that they wouldn't otherwise. And that can be detrimental for everyone.
So what is schizophrenia?
Historically, it was called dementia praecox, a type of dementia that afflicted people in their late teens, early 20s. People die from it. That's initially. However, Eugen Bleuler in Berkeley, he's famous for coining the term schizophrenias. And what he's describing is a constellation of symptoms, autism, auditory hallucinations, that sort of thing. What he envisioned was that this is really a group of psychotic illnesses. That is, people have made a break from reality. They're experiencing unreal things. And it's really a heterogeneous group. And I think over 100 years later, we're starting to come to terms with that. So the main treatment is biopsychosocial approach. So for some people, medication, antipsychotics. 1 in 5 people need clozapine, but they need something stronger.
What's clozapine?
An atypical antipsychotic that's used in reserve for people who are treatment resistant. People have a psychotic break that can be supported with, OTs, that sort of thing, to live life of meaning. Of course, they need support with social workers, with occupational therapists, with psychiatric nurses, with primary care. So they need a whole team around them to help support. I think as time goes on, we'll probably discover that what we're really calling a schizophrenia is probably a whole constellation of different illnesses. And I think the genetics and epigenetics is starting to reveal that.
What's the value of myth, symbolism, and storytelling in the treatment process?
We all have a sort of narrative that we carry around in ourselves, multiple narratives, and that is informed, I think, also by the wider culture. And in our dreams, we have our own private myth. That is to say, we're put in touch with the part of ourselves that is mysterious and paradoxical, what Jung would call the self, with capital S. And it is out of that, then, that we live our lives. And I think in our day-to-day culture, we are all of us looking for a transcendent experience, an experience from love, an experience from our culture, our institutions, our religion, and in ourselves. And if our institutions are corrupt, and if our culture is largely consumerist, and if we're struggling to find love, then we need to go into ourselves to refine that spring again and come home to ourselves.
What do you see as the purpose of dreams as a function of the psyche? Why do we dream?
In Freud's interpretation of dreams, he outlines it as being as a guardian of sleep, to help with sleep, but also as a manifestation of wish fulfillment from the unconscious. It tries to outline it that, but that's a very limited model. There are, of course, dreams that do that. I think Jung is a bit more all-embracing, whereby he would see dreams as communications from this superordinate self, the core of our being. And from that, then, we get a sense of what's going on in the here and now in our life, what those images mean. He would also see dreams as compensatory. I think in my day-to-day clinical work, I see them as communications. I see them as compensatory. I think that they are part and parcel of how the unconscious communicates to us. And given that we spend a third of our lives asleep and hence dreaming, I think that's an important part of our life that we should think about as well.
How would you characterize the road to recovery for a lot of your patients?
Well, I think regression is very necessary. This is part of sickness behavior. People communicate their distress through taking to their bed, through producing these symptoms. And I think people need to be treated with a certain degree of care at that stage because they're very vulnerable people. I think the purpose of regression is to bring them back, or to go back to that earlier stage of relationships development. And you can see that in all sorts of mental illnesses, like with depression, people take to their bed, or with certain types of psychotic depression, they give up eating and drinking and start soiling themselves. So they're going all the way back to the beginning. But I think people can regress so far that they go all the way back beyond that into the source of life itself. And they come out the other end, and by doing that, engaging in everyday life. So many patients are so disabled by deprivation and vulnerabilities, that they really need to be supported, with social workers, with care coordinators, with all these other folks to bring them back into life, by engaging with, whatever it is that's meaningful for them. And I think by doing that, it sets them back on track, what we call individuation, becoming who you're supposed to be. So we live in hope that if you give a number of conditions, that people can get back on track to who they're supposed to be. What that looks like and who that person is, we do not know, but, you have to give them time and patience and allow them to get on with things.
Can you describe one of your most difficult experiences?
I think it was the experience of the pandemic. Obviously, it came out of nowhere, and it created a massive trauma for the healthcare service. Initially, lots of patients stayed in lockdown, stayed in the community, and there was a bit of a lull for the first few months because everyone was contained by all of that. But of course, all these folks have emotional needs that weren't being met. So months and months and months went by, everyone decompensated. And I don't think the service has coped since. And this is not just, the mental health service, the physical health service. And I think there is, at the moment, a great forgetting about the pandemic. That now that it's over, that we just sort of move on and ignore it. But I think there are valuable lessons to learn from it, because it shows in very clear terms how thin is the membrane around our own inner turmoil that came out. I think the psychiatrists, as well as the rest of the doctors, struggled, as well as the nurses, because what was being projected into were incredibly powerful, almost archetypal emotions. So you get all this sort of hero mythology that they're great saviors, but then there's a tremendous denigration. And we're living with this sort of anti-science, persecutory doctor model as well. And I think underscoring a lot of that as well from the healthcare side is burnout. And as a society, I don't think we've cherished or honoured those who worked for the healthcare service during that time.
What would you say the lessons that we're not learning?
I think one is not to forget our history, because straight away after the pandemic started resolving, there was a flood of news articles about how the pandemic didn't really have much of an impact on people's mental health, which of course is nonsense, but people write about that. I think over the past few months and years, I've been interested in the works of Hannah Arendt, the philosopher. So she wrote about Eichmann in Jerusalem and totalitarianism. And the reason I thought about that is because what was the last great collective trauma, of course, is World War II. And I think many years after Second World War, that there was a sort of mass forgetting, not learning from the lessons of history. We haven't really come to terms with imagining a different world for ourselves. So, for instance, after the Second World War, Britain created the NHS, for example, or Anna Freud and all them developed the wartime nurseries. So, imagining a different world. But since we've come out of the pandemic, instead of developing a national care service, we've decided to study it for the next few years. Kick the can down the road. Even though there's a great urgency to deal with these issues in society.
So just moving on to your work with older people, how did that come about?
I think one of the things that struck me most about being in the hospital as a medical student was the fact that the vast majority of patients are the older adults. And I don't think as a society we treat them with the respect that they deserve, because it's a whole part of the population that we just do not see as part of our continuum. A lot of people turn a blind eye to the idea that they'll get older and eventually die. And I think part of that is due to ageism, which still exists. Part of that is that we as a society hate vulnerability. So when we see it, we just turn a blind eye to it. I think there's also prejudices around what their value is in society, because we have a very economically driven one. And obviously, if you're an older adult and you're not working anymore, then suddenly your invisible hand moves you aside. What you see in hospitals is quite a lot of people with delirium, quite a lot of people with dementia, quite a lot of people struggling. And what the answers are, I don't entirely know, but I think we need to actually address it in a more meaningful way. So becoming an old age psychiatrist, I didn't really set out to become one, but eventually, as I said, one's life evokes one's character.
It's interesting to think about how in many other cultures, the elders are highly respected and valued. And in our culture, it seems to not be the case.
No, absolutely not. Older adults are oftentimes seen as a burden, seen as a nuisance, seen as a drain on society. And you see that manifesting in different ways. I think people, continue to develop and grow and individuate as they get older. And I think we need to be more embracing of that.
What does individuation in old age look like?
I think there is such thing as getting older, because I think a useful theory that I keep in my mind is Erikson's psychosocial stages. I don't have them memorized, but the first few are to do with trust, agency, developing relationships, and these developing identity, and these are for a very early age. When one gets into adolescence, more to do with identity, and fidelity, who you start to become, and then there's the next dilemma of are you to be with someone or not? And then eventually generativity versus stagnation. This is from, he estimates, about 35 years onwards, up to 65. So the idea is that you are relating to yourself and relating to the world in a dichotomous way, trying to learn these virtues, essentially. And when you regress, you can go back to these earlier stages. And some people don't navigate them. So, for instance, in the older adult, with the integrity versus despair, you're put in touch with the idea of dying, but it can also bring up all these other stuff, all these regrets, all these, the life unlived. Consistent thing that patients say to me is when I ask them, are they coping with getting older? Most of them say no. And when I invite them to ask, did they what they imagined being older would be like when they were a younger adult, oftentimes they said they couldn't think about it. And I believe them. I think people don't just get old at 65. I think what happens is something in their life, either in the external world or the internal world, can kick off and suddenly plunge them into a feeling of being older. So it could be falling and breaking their wrist. It can suddenly be a feeling of being vulnerable. It can be having dreams that put them in touch with the fact that they're getting older and dying. And the challenge then is supporting them now to navigate that, to live a rewarding life in the last chapter. They've gone from being, fully, largely independent adults, being able to look after themselves, to now suddenly being more and more dependent on other people. And that can be quite devastating. And some people can re-engage with that, and come to terms with it. Some can't. A lot of men can't. A lot of men cannot cope with that. And they can often develop mental health problems for the first time ever in their life, where they might get their first heart attack or stroke, or they might need a walking stick and cannot cope. And it's not necessarily about those specific events, it's about what those events are in the context of their life. So suddenly people feel like that they have vulnerabilities and that these vulnerabilities cannot be dealt with, which of course they can be, but it feels like that.
It would feel as though, as you said, you're kind of plunged into this new state of disability, and there is no way out in terms of you're not going to become not that way. You're not going to regain the physical attributes of your youth. And so seeing a way out of that might feel impossible.
Yeah. I think this is where, the unconscious and the greater self is really important, because I think sometimes that can kick in and people can imagine something different for themselves. Or if they can't, then they probably need help to support them with that. And by that, I don't mean that they all join, church choirs and become born-again Christians and take up gardening. They have to, become who they need to be. That means living a life. It's one of the things that I find quite nauseating on the wards and in services is that we are preoccupied with an older adult who no longer exists anymore. So we start talking to them always about the Second World War or food rations or, all of that. Even though many of these were fully functioning adults, 10, 15 years ago, and we infantilized them. It's what we call elder speak, talking to an older adult like an infant. And that's where they can be sort of persecuted under the medical gaze. They're seen and perceived in a certain way. And some of them can be trapped in that. I think one of the last or the ongoing challenges of institutionalization at the moment is all these care homes, that are growing and growing. The question then is, how do we reimagine a society whereby people can be treated with dignity rather than just being housed away elsewhere?
Yeah, that idea of reimagining is an interesting one in terms of dealing with that shift into old age, reimagining who you are and who you need to be, which includes being old, being physically disabled maybe in some way, and being able to integrate that new imagined self.
Yeah, and that's where I try to hold in my mind the capacity for surprise, because what gives me an ongoing enthusiasm for my role is the fact that people will surprise you all the time. It's somewhere along the lines that they find out, what they need from their lives and what they actually want. They take up new interests, new desires, and the last chapter can be one of the most rewarding. I think as well, there's a certain element of getting older that I think brings into focus the role of death, which I find is very painful, quite difficult, because we're all of us going to die. And the question then becomes, how do we engage with that? Do we ignore it and it just occurs, or do we actively grow towards it? That's a big question.
And I guess that is part of individuation in old age. It's kind of coming to terms with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just in the context of, disabilities. It can be in the context of, mourning your life as well. And obviously getting older brings new life. So you build new relationships, new families, grandchildren, all that sort of thing.
What do you think it means to live one's death?
The word that comes to my mind is a sense of courage, I think. The next word that comes to my mind is integrity, which is very hard to keep in mind day to day. I think also there is a necessity in life to actually be open and honest about who you need to be to live that life. Because oftentimes there is a pressure from the wider world and even, our internal world about becoming an inauthentic self, whereby we're trying to obey someone else. But I think that needs to be thrown off. In Nietzsche's Just Like Zarathustra, he talks about that when you're born, you're like a camel. And life puts a load on your back and gives you a kick in the backside and sends you out into the world. And you're supposed to there transform into a lion. I will. And in the desert is a dragon, which is ancient and is the name of thou shalt. Purpose of the lion is to kill that dragon. When it does, Nietzsche says, you transform into an eternal child. In the precursor to that, Nietzsche wrote The Birth of Tragedy, talks about the Apollonian and the Dionysian spirit in man. The Apollonian being virtuous, rational, full of light, and the Dionysian being chaotic, linked to the Bacchanal. And that is the dichotomy, duality of man, day to day. In Nietzsche's work, he starts identifying then with the Dionysian aspect. So hence why it comes up with this sort of sense of inflated and mythopoetic language that goes into Thus Spake Zarathustra, and reimagines himself as a prophet, Zarathustra, whereby he is going around day to day with a torch, looking for an honest man. But of course, he suddenly realizes it's daytime and he's come too soon. I think this is an important idea in the context of mental health and psychoanalysis, because it is a sort of reimagining of who we are supposed to be, rather than going on a journey in society whereby we just replace another person instead we go on a different journey. So, for instance, I think in National Gallery in Ireland, downstairs there is an exhibition on W.B. Yeats, and they show his astrological and alchemical notebooks. There's also some images as well about what he describes as the left-hand path and the right-hand path. Right-hand path is you go through life conventionally, do what life tells you to do, and you replace the next person. Well, the left-hand path is being unconventional. You go on a journey, and then you come back. And that is a sort of archetypal image of the hero's journey.
What happens at the end stage of life in terms of the self moving towards the final curtain?
Marie-Louise Wolfhans wrote a book about that, and what she thought was that the unconscious acts like it will live forever. So there's part of you that thinks or experiences the world is going on forever. But there's also, the unconscious in the self starts producing symbols and dreams of death, whether it is something about, people from the past coming back into your dreams, or sense of your own vulnerabilities, that sort of thing. I think at the very end, like for instance, if you're terminally, then you start developing delirium. If you live long enough, a lot of people will get dementia. With that then comes a more fragmentation in oneself. So I think there's a sort of needing to let go as well.
What do you think happens after you die?
I imagine it's like what it was like before you were born, because I don't see people as having sort of individual animistic lives. I see people or life itself as one big process. People and all organic things are sort of manifestations of that. So they burst out and bloom and grow and then decay and go back in. That's what the world is.
Have you found that people who do have a firm belief in the afterlife tend to cope better?
It's hard to say, because I think, regardless if you're atheist or Christian or whatever, I think everyone has different forms of faith and different ways of experiencing the world that sort of hold it together. But of course, as Althusser calls it, an epistemological rupture. Something can come in outside the symbolic and tear through that. It can be things like the pandemic or the wars in individuals. It can be bad news, bad diagnosis, a marriage breaking down, that sort of thing. That can tear through everything, and that, is a sort of dark night of the soul. Person plunges into that. And the question is, how can you get out of that? Sometimes people can rediscover their faith after many years, many decades. And that can come in people's dreams, or they can have an epiphany, or they can suddenly be put in touch with something greater than themselves. And they find that very helpful. And that can take many forms. That can either be the God of a church, or it can be nature, or it can be something greater than themselves, a community.
Do you think as a society, the kind of regression of faith in general has served us?
I think Kierkegaard said it best when he talks about anxiety is our religion, and each day we rise to worship it. And the idea there is that modern humanity is alienated from himself, and in that alienation is bereft of being connected with the wider world, and is feeling what is called angst and the pain of being alive. So the question then is, how does one re-engage with life, with yourself, with the wider world, so that those feelings can be overcome, or at least lived with? I don't think that the world is any less spiritual than it's ever been. I think it ebbs and flows in terms of membership to churches. I think people project archetypal parts of themselves onto the wider world. The gods of the ancient world aren't gone away. They've just manifested as things like celebrities. So people attribute to these folks all sorts of magical powers and abilities. And of course, some of these individuals identify with these archetypal powers and develop a sort of sense of inflation.
In terms of writers and thinkers, who would you list amongst your greatest influences, and what were the ideas that they put forward that really influence how you think about your work?
Many of the major psychoanalytical thinkers, Jung, Freud, Lacan, Mendy Klein, and Michael Balint. In terms of philosophers, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Marshall McLuhan.
Not heard of Lacan before. And what were his ideas?
Jacques Lacan was a French psychiatrist. I think born in 1900, died 1986, 1987. He trained at the Salpêtrière in Paris, and then became a psychoanalyst. He is famous for what's called a return to Freud. The idea is an application of linguistics and a modern understanding of psychology to reread Freud's works. So for about 50 years, he held seminars to apply, because what he discovered in Freud's early works is the role of linguistics and language and meaning. And so he gave us terms like the mirror stage, that is to say, the stage at which we develop a coherent sense of identity. And his other idea is the role of the ego. So the purpose of the ego is to perpetuate the illusion that the ego exists in this plane of alienation, because it gives the individual a sense of cohesion, whereby underlying all of that is fragmentation. And that's really important for therapy, because he says that if the person is coming to you in therapy, who are you actually talking to in the room? The illusion is that you're talking to the person who says, I want therapy. But who you're really talking to is the subject of the unconscious. So a person can say, I want therapy, but then suddenly they get into therapy, and so all the resistances come out. But you need to talk to the other part. And the idea there is that if you just talk to the ego part, then no therapy can happen. So both you and the patient get trapped in the illusion and can't get out of it. So the idea is that you need to link it to the symbolic rather than just the imaginary.
You think about how far we've come in terms of understanding and working with complex mental health issues. Where do you see it being able to go in the future?
I don't think we'll be able to progress unless we understand our history and what it means, because psychiatrist is only a new branch of medicine. And prior to that, we were all called alienists, so big asylums looking after all of them. And in that sense, psychiatry is part of the project of the Enlightenment, not just, engaging in emancipating humanity from superstitions, but actually, as Kant would say, dare to know, sapere aude. And in Foucault's, rereading of his essay, What is Enlightenment, he has this paragraph of saying, Enlightenment has to be considered not as a body of accumulating knowledge or theories. Instead, rather, it has to be an attitude, an ethos, a philosophical life in which the critique of what we are is one at the same time the historical analysis of the limits posed upon us and an experiment of going beyond them.
What do you think gives your life meaning?
I think it's a search for things that make me actually feel alive. Of course, these are, friends, family, loved ones. Like a lot of doctors, work is a big part of that. But I think it doesn't have to be a drag. I think if you can turn work into play, then that's the real task.
And how do you do that?
I'll tell you when I've completed it,